Warren Spahn pitched 6 hitless innings on the 27th of July, 1946, one of the finest stretches of his career. It is also the night he lost something he never fully got back. Decades later, asked about the moment he understood what Stan Musial truly was, he always returned to that exact game. Spahn won 363 games, more than any left-hander in history, and crossed a bridge under fire at Remagen to earn the right to pitch at all. He never handed out credit lightly. So when those closest to him said Musial, in 1945, neither man was playing baseball for a living. Spahn was in the army, part of the push across the Rhine, present for the taking of the bridge at Remagen, wounded badly enough during the fighting to earn a Purple Heart, and decorated separately for conduct under fire that earned him a Bronze Star. He almost never spoke about specifics. Those who served alongside him said certain things did not need retelling, and certain silences said more than any story could. Musial, meanwhile, was stationed with the Navy out in Hawaii, drilling by day and playing service league ball on rough dirt infields by evening. His swing, the only thread still connecting him to the life he had left behind in St. Louis. Both men came home in 1946 carrying the same quiet assumption that every returning veteran carried with them, that the war would have taken something physical, something timing-related, a half-step nobody could fully get back no matter how hard they trained that spring. Spahn admitted, much later in his life, that he took the mound again, still flinching at sounds that weren't there, his hands remembering recoil before they remembered rotation, his whole body recalibrating to a game that suddenly felt small and strange after what he had just lived through overseas. He assumed the man across the diamond would be carrying that same weight into the season. On the night in question, at Braves Field in Boston, Spahn was untouchable in a way pitchers wait an entire career to feel even once. Through 6 full innings, the Louis lineup managed nothing of consequence. No clean contact, no hard line drives finding the gaps, nothing that troubled an outfielder or made a crowd lean forward in its seats. Hitter after hitter walked back to a dugout that grew quieter with every passing out, the particular silence that settles over a team watching something happen to someone else and knowing there isn't much to be done about it. Only one Cardinal reached base across that entire stretch, and he didn't get there by hitting anything at all. In the 4th inning, Stan Musial drew a walk, 4 pitches taken without offering at a single one, his crouched and almost backward stance betraying nothing as the count built against him. He didn't lean into the close pitches. He didn't flinch at the ones that came tight against his hands. He simply let each one pass, watching it the way a man watches something he already understands, then walked toward first base wearing the same flat, unreadable expression he might have carried buying a newspaper on an ordinary morning. To the crowd, it registered as nothing more than a forgettable footnote tucked inside something close to history. A walk in the middle of a near-perfect game, gone from most memories before the next batter even stepped in. Spahn remembered it differently, and he kept remembering it differently for the rest of his life. Even as he set Musial down without forcing a single swing out of him, some quiet part of him understood that the exchange had. Most pitchers who faced Stan Musial talked about fear, the particular kind that settles into a man's chest the moment Musial dug his back foot into the dirt and turned that strange, almost backward stance toward the mound. Warren Spahn's account, told quietly to teammates over the years, and later repeated to reporters who kept pushing him for details, never matched that description. He didn't describe fear at all. He described the unsettling sensation of being read, the way a man feels when he realizes someone across the room has already finished a thought he himself hasn't started yet. Musial's eyes, Spahn said, never drifted toward the scoreboard, never wandered out to the bleachers, never gave away a single flicker of anything that didn't matter to the pitch directly in front of him. Other hitters in that league were guessing. They swung at hope and adjusted after the fact. Musial was doing something else entirely, something closer to listening than watching. And he did it so quietly that an entire ballpark full of people could miss it while cheering the same pitcher who was, in that very moment, being quietly taken apart. Spahn felt it most in the 4th inning, standing 60 feet away from a man who had just watched 4 pitches sail past him without offering at one. There was no twitch in Musial's shoulders, no tightening around his jaw, nothing a scout could have written down and called useful. He simply walked toward first base wearing the same unreadable calm he might have carried walking into church on a Sunday morning. And that calm followed Spahn back to the mound like something he couldn't quite shake off his sleeve. Every other man Spahn had retired that season left something behind him. A curse muttered under the breath, a bat thrown a little too hard into the rack, some small proof that the moment had cost them something. Musial left nothing. He simply absorbed it, filed it somewhere behind those calm eyes, and moved on as though the at-bat had never happened at all. That was the part Spahn couldn't shake for the rest of his career. The part he kept circling back to whenever someone asked him to explain it. He had just thrown one of the finest innings of his life, and somehow he walked off that mound feeling like the lesser man in the exchange. It wasn't humiliation. It was something quieter and far more lasting, a small crack of doubt that opened in a place Spahn hadn't even known existed until that night. He had faced hundreds of hitters by then, men with bigger swings and louder reputations, and none of them had ever made him feel quite so exposed while standing on the one piece of ground where he was supposed to feel untouchable. Years later, when people pressed him on why a simple walk in the fourth inning meant more to him than the 6 hitless innings around it, Spahn would grow quiet for a moment, the way men do when they're deciding whether a memory is worth handing over. Then he'd say, almost reluctantly, that Musial hadn't just been standing in that batter's box that night. He had been studying him, learning him, and somewhere underneath the scoreboard's silence, Spahn had felt himself being understood by a man who never once swung the bat. The 6th inning ended, and Spahn's bid for something historic was still breathing, still alive, the kind of thing a young pitcher carries home with him no matter what happens after. He walked off that mound feeling the particular electricity that only comes once or twice in a career, the sense that the baseball gods had decided, just for one night, to let everything fall his way. Then the 7th inning began, and Stan Musial walked back into the batter's box for a second look at him. There was nothing dramatic about it. No towering swing, no ball climbing into the dark Boston sky while the crowd rose to its feet. It was almost insulting in its simplicity, a clean ground ball hit with no more violence than a man knocking on a door. But it found the one gap in the infield that actually mattered, slipping through exactly where the defense had been shaded wrong all evening without anyone realizing it. It scored a run. It tied the game. And somewhere in the press box, the quiet conversation about a no-hitter simply stopped, the way a held breath finally lets go. What stayed with Spahn for the rest of his life wasn't the speed of the ball or how far it traveled across that infield grass. It was the precision behind it, the sense that nothing about that single had been left to chance. Musial had taken an entire scouting report's worth of information from one quiet walk 3 innings earlier and tucked it away somewhere nobody could see, behind a face that gave away absolutely nothing. He hadn't needed 5 at-bats to learn Spahn. He'd needed one pitch he chose not to swing at, and the patience to wait for the moment that pitch would matter again. He did not pump his fist rounding first base. He did not glance toward the mound to measure whatever was left of Spahn's expression. He simply jogged back toward the bag with the same unbothered calm he carried into every at-bat that season, as if the outcome had been decided long before that pitch ever left Spahn's hand, as if the whole sequence had been written somewhere, and Musial was only walking through it. For Spahn, that was the moment the night changed shape entirely. He had pitched 6 innings of something close to perfection, and it had all come undone not because of power or aggression, but because one man had simply paid closer attention than everyone else in the building. There was no anger in him watching it happen, only a strange, hollow kind of respect, the sort that creeps in slowly and never fully leaves. He would talk about that ground ball for years afterward, not because it ended a no-hitter, but because of what it revealed underneath the box score. Somewhere in that quiet single was proof that Musial hadn't simply gotten lucky, hadn't simply guessed right. He had earned that moment 3 innings earlier, in a walk nobody else in the ballpark thought twice about, and carried it forward with a patience that felt almost unfair to a man standing 60 feet away with nothing left to throw at him. For years afterward, Spahn found himself returning to that single more often than he returned to games he had actually lost, by wider, more painful margins. It wasn't pride that kept pulling him back to it. It was something closer to confusion, the kind that lingers in a man's chest long after the moment itself has passed. He had genuinely believed, walking onto that mound in 1946, that the war would have cost Musial something. Not everything, just enough. a half-step lost somewhere between Hawaii and home plate. A fraction of a second in recognition time, the kind of small, invisible erosion that combat tends to leave behind in a man's body, whether he ever notices it happening or not. It hadn't cost Musial anything at all. If anything, he had come back from the Pacific sharper than before, as though those rough dirt infields in Hawaii had given him more patience instead of less, more stillness instead of less certainty. Spahn admitted, much later in his life, that this was the part he struggled to make peace with. He had assumed greatness was fragile, that it bent and dulled under enough pressure the way most things do. Musial seemed to prove the opposite. Whatever had happened to him out there in the Pacific, it hadn't taken anything from him. It had simply rearranged something inside him into a shape that was harder to rattle. Spahn recognized that particular stillness because he carried a version of it himself, quietly, in places he didn't often talk about. He had crossed a bridge under fire at Remagen and come home a different man than the one who left, though he rarely said so out loud. There was a stubbornness in him, too, a refusal to let one lost year overseas define everything that came after it on a baseball field. Two men who had been shot at, who had watched friends not make it home from places with names that meant nothing to anyone back in the stands, found their way back to a game that suddenly felt almost too small for what they had each survived, separately, an ocean apart from each other. That was the connection Spahn could never quite explain to anyone who hadn't lived through something similar. It wasn't admiration in the simple sense. It was recognition, the uncomfortable kind that settles into a man slowly and doesn't ask permission first. He understood Musial's calm in that batter's box, not because he had studied it from the outside, but because he understood exactly what that kind of calm had to cost a person on the other side of a war. It wasn't talent that built it. It was something closer to survival, carried quietly into a stadium full of people who had no idea what they were actually watching. In the years that followed, whenever Spahn faced him again, that same feeling would return for just a moment, brief and unspoken, somewhere between the wind-up and the pitch. He never said it to Musial directly. Men like Spahn rarely did. But it was there every time. A small, private understanding passed between two men who had each found their way back from somewhere darker, carrying it differently, carrying it quietly, never once needing to say it out loud to know the other one felt it too. The season that followed told the rest of the story without requiring Spahn to say another single word about it publicly. Musial led the league in nearly every offensive category that mattered that year, won his second Most Valuable Player award, and carried the Cardinals to their third World Series title in 5 seasons, all of it accomplished in his very first full year back from military service. Spahn watched it unfold the way a man watches weather he had quietly predicted, but secretly hoped wouldn't actually arrive on schedule. There was no real satisfaction in being proven right about it. There was something closer to recognition, the uncomfortable kind, the sort that forces a fierce competitor to respect an opponent more than he wants to admit out loud, even to himself, late at night. Over the long seasons that followed, the two men faced each other dozens upon dozens of times across nearly 2 decades of National League baseball, and the particular feeling from that July night in 1946 never fully left Spahn for the rest of his career. Every time Musial stepped into the batter's box against him afterward, there was a small, private acknowledgement passing quietly between the two of them, the unspoken sense that Spahn was pitching to someone who had already solved the entire test long before the first pitch was even thrown that day. War can take a man's best years. It can take his sleep, his certainty, sometimes his nerve, and sometimes it takes pieces of him he never fully gets back, no matter how long he keeps playing the game afterward, no matter how many seasons pass. What it could not take from Stan Musial was the thing Warren Spahn recognized that night in Boston, hidden inside a walk that almost nobody remembers and a single that nobody bothered to photograph. Real greatness does not usually announce itself with anything as loud as a home run disappearing into a dark summer sky. More often, it shows up quietly, as 4 pitches taken without a single flinch, and one unremarkable ground ball that finds the only gap left open on an entire infield. Spahn pitched the game of his life that night, 6 hitless innings that should have belonged to him and him alone in the record books. He still lost a piece of it to a man who barely swung the bat at all.